We are here today for the third in our series about third in our series of virtual meetups, all about movement ecology as part of our tracking progress project. Today we're here to talk about data sharing and archiving, and in our next session we'll wrap up the full series with a big picture, future forward-looking discussion about future questions and tools that we can be looking at to answer questions about movement ecology. Today we're joined by our three wonderful speakers and also Sarah Davidson, who is on our advisory group for this project. So she'll be introducing the topic. And as a reminder, this whole project is about looking to the future of movement ecology. What innovations, what funding priorities do we have to look at to catapult this field forward? And we're thinking in terms of a couple of different horizons. The first horizon is the questions we know the answers to and innovations we know need to happen, and we just need to throw a brute force, a lot of funding at it. So things sitting on that second horizon. But we're also interested in looking a bit further forward and looking a bit more blue sky and the bigger picture of where could we go? We don't know how to get there yet, and we don't know quite what is needed, but what are the possibilities for a big leap forward in this field? So we're trying to, through these virtual events, and then we'll be also doing some closed focus group conversations at a horizon scan to try and look at these two questions. Just as a reminder, this is part of a bigger research project, which we do have ethics approval for. This whole session is being recorded. We will put it on YouTube afterwards, so you can watch it later. And just by participating, you're agreeing to, by staying in the call, you're agreeing to participate in this research. And if you've got questions, feel free to message Talia or Jennifer at the email addresses there. Right, that is enough from me. I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, which is Sarah Davidson. And Sarah, while you're getting set up, I am going to do a little introduction so we know who you are and why we've invited you here. Oh, you were so quick. Hang on. Okay. Sarah is the Movebank PI and data curator for the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior. She is a go-to expert in the wild labs and conservation communities for all things movement data related, working hard to make these data accessible now and into the future. Sarah is also a member of our advisory committee for the Tracking Progress project and will be providing a brief introduction to the topic and relevant questions today ahead of the other speakers. Sarah.
All right, can you see the slide and hear me okay?
We can. Take it away.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I am just going to briefly welcome you all. Thank you for being here. And I'm going to briefly kind of give some context and questions that we can think about during our talks and discussions today. Oh, did it work? Did it switch? Okay, good. So in movement ecology, we have a huge number of places where we are successfully sharing and archiving data. And our speakers today are going to give some really fabulous stories and examples of how we're doing that. And with our existing infrastructure, we are running global acoustic and radio-telemetry systems. We are developing and using shared software and programs for data analysis. We're meeting data sharing requirements for journals, funders, and permitting agencies. And we are running countless collaborations for research and conservation. And we also have produced a number of kind of larger synthesis projects that are offering new data products and are really advancing our understanding of animal behavior and movements on large scales. I will say, however, these are still very slow. These take years in my experience and from talking with others. And it's okay if it takes a long time because we're doing the science, right? It takes a long time to do this kind of integrated science. But a lot of the time is really, a lot of it is still spent arranging data sharing and organizing the data. And so I would argue we still have significant technical and policy hurdles to connecting data and people at scale. And so why does that matter? That matters because we're experiencing many overlapping and rapid changes, and we need to be able to document, recognize, and respond to these more quickly. And I see a ton of potential for this in movement ecology. And then as far as archiving goes, in my experience, most data sharing in movement ecology is still done on a case-by-case basis. And in most cases, there's not a plan for how those data will be made available for future generations. And so a couple of indications that suggest to me that much of these data will be inaccessible within, say, a decade or two. One, on Movebank, it's just under 9%, this is pretty consistent, of studies in Movebank that allow, excuse me, public download. And that would be kind of the gold standards for assuring future access. There's a paper by Campbell et al. That looked at data permitted for tracking studies in New Zealand. And they found that years after, it was less than 9% of data when they went online were able to find those data available for public viewing or download. And so I will also argue that we have one reason for these challenges is that we have no shared community standards for data discovery, storage, transfer, or archiving. And by community standards, I mean ones that we could use across political and taxonomic boundaries, that we could use across platforms, and that would allow participation, open participation in development. And we do have some that have been proposed, but they've not been widely implemented. So some things to think about today. One is, how can we be learning from or working with other fields that are using similar technology and data? This came out a couple of weeks ago. This is the Economist Technology Quarterly, and it's all about human wearable sensors. So this kind of concept is going mainstream, and I see a lot of opportunity for us to maybe leverage this interest for conservation and ecology. Second, how do we balance data openness with maximizing participation? And so in particular, when it comes to sensitive data, how do we determine what data are sensitive? And how do we ensure long-term and secure archiving for those? Second is, all those many data platforms I showed on the first slide, those exist in part because they're offering really helpful resources for specific groups or projects, and they're designed around those. However, having our data dispersed across so many places is making it harder to find and use them. And so what types of shared standards or policies could complement existing efforts? And then finally, how can we coordinate and finance these? Because I think this is maybe the big question that we often end up stuck at. So I will leave it at that, and let's get started with our speakers. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. David, did you want to ask the question while we've got Sarah here?
Yeah, sure. So most of my experience is with acoustic data sets, and I'm just trying to make sure that I have the right context for all the talks moving forward. What are we talking about in terms of number of gigabytes?
Gigabyte?
Kind of like in terms of actual quantity of data and difficulties involved there, how big are these data sets?
Well, gosh, if we get into the video and camera trapping, and my experience is more with the animal tracking stuff, those can be just one project, can easily be gigabytes. Okay. So I would say we're somewhere in terabytes, but I'm not sure how we would get to that number, but it's big.
Awesome. Okay. Our first speaker is Abby, right? Yes. Abby, do you want to pop your presentation up, and I'll do an intro for you. Right. Abby is a biologist in the Science, Analytics and Synthesis program of USGS. We invited Abby here to share her insights as a manager of some of the most critical global data platforms of our time, including GBIF and OBIS, as well as her experience leading efforts in advancing the adoption of data standards, which have been widely recognized as a major challenge and need in this space. So Abby, we're really excited to have you here and interested to hear your thoughts. Do you want to take it away?
Great. Yep. Happy to take it away. Yeah, so what I am excited to talk to you guys about today are community and standards are the backbone to integrated species observations. And so, yeah, great. Steph already did an introduction for me, so I'll just move right along here. So it's always fun to start off with this very beautiful picture where you can clearly see all those red places where we have a lot of observations of species. These are coming from multiple data providers across organizations, globally, across nodes. So lots of people contributing this data. And you can see, first you see the red and the orange, but then you see the blue and the greens, and you realize we still have work to do to really have a full picture of species out there. And also taxonomically, there are gaps there too that I think this community would really be poised to fill. And so what we're trying to do is provide biodiversity evidence for research and policy. So there's lots of people out there, lots of different ways of collecting data. It's coming from museums, it's coming from governments, universities, citizen science. So we're all collecting this data, right? And it's multiple forms. So it's specimens, it's human observations, it's machine observations like you all would have, literature, remote sensing, DNA. So all different types of ways of trying to observe the species on our planet. And what really makes this so that we can integrate it together and have like a shared resource are open licenses and standards. So using standards means that we can integrate these data sets from all these different places using all these different ways of collecting data. We can integrate them together into a shared index like the Global Biodiversity Information Facility Global Index. And then once they're integrated, we can share it out through cloud services, through gbif.org, and also through APIs. So making it available in multiple ways for research and for policy. So lots of different analyses out there and research going on using these data and creating indicators, as well as policy bodies really needing this information and what they're doing. And so who really needs this data? Well, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, is one such body that uses this data in the assessments they're doing on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And they need data across multiple data sets, across organizations in order to really answer the questions that they're trying to answer. Similarly, there's the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which have targets that we're trying to meet. And if we're going to say how we're doing towards those targets, we're going to need data to do that. And it's going to come from multiple places, and it's going to need to be integrated together. And then there's also the 2020, the Global Biodiversity Framework, following on from the Aichi targets, where we also have that need for understanding at national and global scales. And data integration enables global biodiversity synthesis. So here's a paper by Heberling et al. Out last year, just showing the wide range of ways that these data are used across biodiversity analysis across that research field, but also into chemistry and physics. There's so many ways these data are being used for understanding our world, and it's really exciting. So my favorite example of how these data are being used to inform policy is this IPCC special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. In this report, they cited a paper that used more than 385 million GBIF-mediated occurrence records to analyze the difference between 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius and how that would affect geographic range losses due to climate change. And what it will do is it'll cut them in half. So the way they were able to do this analysis is they were able to go to GBIF, download so many observations of species, run these analyses, and then this paper gets used in these policymaking reports that are needed for our understanding at these global scales and national scales. And there's lots of different ways that this is being used. So, here's just an assortment of conservation ways that the data in GBIF are being used. from assessing gaps in protected areas of Brazil to assessing biases and broader applicability of expert range maps. So just lots of ways to use the data. And these are just a few, but I'm sure you all could think of much of more. And so, okay, I'm excited. Yes, let's get our data in here so it can be used. How do I do it? Well, for GBIF, one of the main standards that are used is Darwin Core. So what this does is, let's say we have 3 different data sets, they're all formatted differently. You transform them to Darwin Core, then all the column headers are the same, and the information in those columns is following the standard. So this means that we can integrate them together, and then researchers and policymakers can perform observation level extraction. So if they really just want to know about a particular region, or they're only interested in certain taxa, you can do that because the data are following standards. And so you can actually grab those out and do the analyses that you're wanting to do. And so, okay, we've integrated the data, it's available. One of the ways I wanted to highlight for you all that it's accessible is through cloud computing services. So GBIF provides snapshots of the data to Microsoft Azure, Amazon Web Services, and Google BigQuery. And so this means that any data that you shared to GBIF would be available in these cloud services and would be integrated together with other data like citizen science and any other data sets that might be in there on climate data, other forms of data that you would want to merge this with, environmental data that you would want to do these kind of big analyses with. One other thing I wanted to highlight for you about what GBIF is doing, here's a data set that USGS published back in 2017, and GBIF is doing some pretty innovative data citation tracking. So you can see there's 133 citations for this data set. And what GBIF does is when you go in and as a researcher or someone using the data, you go in and you select a subset of the data that you want to use. You get, and let's say that's coming from 500 different data sets. Well, you get one DOI that's specific to that subset of data that you can cite in your paper. And when you cite that in a paper, all of those 500 data sets get credit, get linked to that paper to say this was how this data is being used. So what's nice about that is you don't really want to cite 500 DOIs. That's going to be kind of hard to do. So having one DOI, but still the credit goes to the 500 different data providers is really innovative and makes it easy to do. And so if there's one thing that I'd like you to take away from this presentation, if you're using someone else's data, make sure to cite the DOI. It's really important that people get credit for doing this work of sharing their data. And so my take-home messages for you today are that big questions require big data, and that data is going to come from multiple sources. We're really going to need to integrate across projects, across all these different organizations in order to be able to answer the big questions we need and we need to do, and we need to use standards to do that. Standards is what makes that possible. Integrated and openly accessible movement data will improve our understanding of global biodiversity and feed into research and policy making. You here have an opportunity to really fill those data gaps, and there's really not very much machine observation data in GBIF yet. So this is a big opportunity, and I think it can make a really big difference. And the community is what makes this work. This is a bunch of people working together, deciding to do things the same way, deciding to use Darwin Core as a standard. And so when we work together, we can accomplish really great things, I think. And I did put a little note at the bottom here to highlight that there is a guide to sensitive species occurrences, because I saw a question about that from one of the participants. So there is a way to share the data even for sensitive species, and there's a guide on how to do that. So, so maybe check that out, and I can talk more about it if needed. So that's it for me, and I will stop sharing.
That was awesome. Thanks so much, Abby. To get us started, I wanted to throw to a question one of our earlier speakers asked as she registered for this, this topic. It was Melinda Holland from Wildlife Computers, and asked, what can the community do to get metadata standards accepted? Because standardized metadata allows data to be findable. Do you have any thoughts?
Excuse me. Yes, I have thoughts. Use standards that are already existing. Please don't create your own. There's already standards out there, and they're already approved, and they're already being used. And so I didn't put up the XKCD comic where it's like, we need a standard to do this, and then there's 14 standards, and at the end there's 15 standards. But if there is like a different standard that you really there are standards bodies out there. So TADWIG is the standards body that oversees Darwin Core. There's ISO. So there are standards bodies if you really want to get, push that through to get a new standard approved. But I would encourage everyone to use existing standards and contribute to them and participate in them and add what doesn't work for you and try to integrate in with the existing standards so that we're not developing a new one. We're making sure the ones that exist work for your data.
Another question. Oh, sorry.
Can I add something to that? So one thing, I think sometimes people look at standards that exist and they're like, well, it doesn't fit my exact thing. And so I think that like with TEDWIG in particular, like they've got GitHub stuff, go in and ask questions, go in and suggest things. And a big part where as movement ecology, how we engage with that is we may need to collectively figure out, here's the protocol you do for using this standard. And there might be some ways of using the standard that might be unique to us. And so in the case of biologging data, we actually have quite a bunch of, we've made some like progress on that. Like, how do we use Darwin Core? How do we apply it to our data? And so that's the conversation, and that's all public on GitHub. I can post some links. So that's a conversation that can happen, and that could lead to like movement ecology or for camera trapping could adopt the standard, right? So a data platform could adopt the standard, and then they could publish a shared, here's how we all use it. And that's the thing that can happen at the community level that means that we don't have to make a new standard. But we can make our own way for how we use the existing standard. And that's what I think then maybe we feel more like invested in it and it becomes more useful.
Yeah, that's something that came through in some of the focus groups discussions we had in the State of Conservation Tech, that like the way to get data standards like propagated through the community is by working with the tech companies and the tech developers and to align with the standards that already exist. Seems to echo what you're saying, Sarah. I just have one more question. One of your slides, Abby, you mentioned, you gave a nod to the planetary computer and a lot of the tech company-led initiatives in this space. I was wondering if there are any concerns, or I always wonder if, who should be leading those efforts, and if it's an independent, if there are any concerns around the involvement of the big tech companies and them pushing the way forward in standards and data collection and curation and storage, and whether we should be concerned about anything. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I would say that, I think GBIS sees those as an opportunity for a way to get the data used rather than tech companies saying how the data should be formatted or anything like that. I mean, the data, the snapshots that are shared are using Darwin Core. And so, the big tech companies aren't necessarily telling us how we should be, formatting our data. But it is a big opportunity because these are big data. I mean, there are over 2 billion occurrence records in GBIF. And if you're going to analyze that, you're going to need kind of a big computer to do that if you're going to do all of them. So, and with movement ecology, there will be a lot more. So having ways to do that efficiently, I think will be a good thing. But yeah, I think there are always some concerns about how to do that well. And so hopefully I think it's being done well, but I would like to hear from others if that's not the case. So.
We might bring that up in the group discussion. Okay, thank you so much, Abby. I'm going to call on Rafael next. Rafael, while you get your slides up, I'm going to do a little intro for you. Okay. Rafael works for WWF Bolivia, coordinating the Pantanal Chaco landscape and leading Wildlife Connect, a partnership that aims to protect, manage, and restore the ecological connectivity of landscapes, enabling large-scale wildlife movement and linking wildlife and people. We've invited Rafael here to share his expertise as a conservationist responsible for coordinating movement data, sharing across a wide range of stakeholders in diverse landscapes. We thought his perspective and experience would be a really interesting view to bring into the discussion. So we're delighted you've joined us. Rafael, do you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here. As you said, I am Rafael Antelo. I'm a Spanish biologist. I've been working and living in South America for the last 20 years. And now I'm leading this interesting, amazing to me initiative. It's called Wildlife Connect. It's a joint initiative between WWF, the Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group of the IUCN, and the CLC, the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, based in Bozeman, Montana. And I'm going to explain you a very particular situation we're passing through right now, because we work in large landscapes in which we cannot work alone, as our vision says in WWF, together possible. We need to have the collaboration of some other stakeholders, in this case, scientists. And what we are passing through a very interesting situation, I think, that I want to share with you. But for giving you a little bit of context, as you know, this initiative is about ecological connectivity, the wildlife movements, the flow of ecological processes in these large and iconic landscapes, like this picture here of the wildebeest migration between the Masai Mara and the Serengeti, Kenya and Tanzania. And as you know, ecological connectivity is very important to maintain the ecosystem healthy and the wildlife thriving. But we have two major threats for connectivity, which is linear infrastructure, roads, railways, pipelines, gas lines, fences, and land use change, like in many other situations. What we want to get at the end is this what we call the ecological network. It's when you have the protected areas connected through ecological corridors, like these narrow, dark green polygons, or through new protected areas, like the one here in the north of Bhutan. This is a real example. This country, in just 8 years, connected the whole protected areas, losing very few protection. But, well, this is the example we all like, but what we usually find is this. Now, the protected areas, the core areas, isolated into the matrix. For example, here in South America, just 30% of the protected areas are effectively connected. And we have everything in the landscape. We have roads, we have villages, we have fences, we have crops, we have cattle ranchers. So we have developed this theory of change to address this situation. And I'm going to be focusing the first step here in science, because the first thing we have to do is to map the ecological network. Now, it's when you have to identify where are the protected areas or the core areas, which is something quite easy, but not so easy to identify where are the corridors connecting these protected areas that are being used by the wildlife. There are many ways to do it. You can use functional connectivity, structural connectivity, and once you have that, you have to do some advocacy to include this connectivity, these ecological corridors, into the spatial planning and governance. And you can find 3 main situations when you have to protect the corridors, which is not the most common, unfortunately, manage, which is the most common situation, manage for wildlife permeability, or to restore, which is the most common, for example, in Europe or United States, when you have to build these ecoducts or overpasses or underpasses. So we have 4 demonstrative landscapes. As I said, there are big ones, one in each continent, and the ones I'm going to be focused is the one here in South America. We call PACHA, because it includes the Pantanal and the Chaco landscape. And talking about connectivity, you can use many species, focal species, but we selected the jaguar for several reasons. It's an umbrella species. In theory, if you secure jaguar connectivity, you are securing also the connectivity of other species. And also because this study developed by Pantera around 10, 12 years ago, they identified that the corridors of concern of the species, which in theory we have a continuous distribution from Mexico to Argentina, most of the corridors of concern were here in PACHA, which is a transboundary landscape. It's served by Bolivia, Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina. We have the world's largest tropical wetland, the Pantanal, and also the largest tropical dry forest, the Chaco, and two main threats. Of course, we have a lot, but deforestation, we have one of the main deforestation fronts in the world here in the Chaco because of the soy and beef industries. And climate change in Pantanal, we have lost 30% of the surface water in the last 30 years. So this is a big problem. But we also have strong indigenous territories and protected areas, especially here in Bolivia. And we also still remains the uncontacted Yoreo people in the border between Bolivia and Paraguay. It's the only one outside of the Amazon. So we are also involved in a bigger strategy, the WWF Jaguar strategy, in which they have prioritized 15 landscapes, and 3 of them are here in PACHA. It is the Pantanal, the Chaco, and El Impenetrable. As I said, we have some large number of corridors of concern, and we have evidence that we have lost connectivity between this jaguar conservation unit here. It's called the Atlantic Forest, and the impenetrable. We have genetic data that we have lost that. So we started to look for connectivity approaches in the region. We found some of them. All of them were different, with different focus. The Argentina one was focused on the jaguar, and they get these results, these corridors. Then the Bolivia one was focused on humid areas, which to me is very new and very interesting. The humid corridors. We have another exercise done by Embrapa, Brazil, and they identify a large number of corridors, mainly based on structural connectivity for a section of the 3 countries, Brazil, Bolivia, and Paraguay, in the upper river basin. So when we were talking with the science team, they say, well, we cannot use this. We need a comprehensive model for PACHA, for the jaguar. And this is when we decided that we need to create the ecological network for PACHA. And we decided to invite a group of experts on jaguar and/or connectivity to a workshop to identify, to form first this connectivity group in PACHA to share information about the jaguar, because as I said, it's 1 million square kilometers, and we have some information, good information in some areas, but some other areas are deserts in terms of information. So we have to build a model, and we need to have as much information as we can. And the expected product of this workshop is this map representing the vision of the ecological connectivity in PACHA. So with the focal points of each country, we invited this expert. Most of them are partners of WWF in the countries. We prepare a very detailed agenda. We work a lot in the workshop, sorry, it's in Spanish. But once we were there, and we start to ask them or to explain them what we wanted to do, that we need their expertise and their data. We were very clear that we were only expecting published data, but for some reason they understand also the unpublished data. So they have 2 main claims. They don't think that we need a comprehensive model for the whole PACHA, and they were claiming about data sharing. Say, no, this is unpublished data. This is new research. We cannot share with you. This is a PhD thesis, a master thesis, whatever. So they smashed our agenda just in 1 hour and a half. It was a 2 days workshop. We have to do a great adaptive management to rebuild the agenda just in 10 minutes. We give them the opportunity to talk, all of them, what they did, what they are doing, what they were expecting. And at the end, the good thing is that they understood that it was important to build this comprehensive model, although they are doing a great job in the regions, in their territories. But we need this comprehensive model for some reason, for many reasons, not for science, to do some fundraising. And after 2 days of discussing, we get to the start point, and they agree to collaborate and share their knowledge with us. So we built this table with them, which we select which variables are important for jaguar movements in the territory, and we ask them to give us a resistant value, sorry, it's in Spanish again, a resistance value depending on the variable of the landscape. Of course, variables that can be put in a GIS analysis. So we have forests, we have grasslands, we have crops, we have human density, we have roads, and now in this moment, we create the group. Finally, we create the group. We are 50 stakeholders, 50 experts on connectivity and jaguars in this Google group, and they are filling this resistance value. Then we have to get an agreement to get a final number. And at the end, what we are going to have is for every pixel in this PACHA landscape, a value. When the highest values means the highest resistance, for example, a big city, and the lowest values means the lowest resistance to jaguar movement. So this is the theory. So if you want to connect one protected area to another, the origin to destination, in theory, the jaguar is going to use the least cost values. So you have the least cost path, and then you can build the least cost corridor. This is the theory. Then you have to prove that actually the animals, the jaguars, are using this corridor, but this is a different story. The thing is that once we have there, we want to share this information with two experts that are leading connectivity, as I would say, in the worldwide. One of them is Robin Edu and his team. They have developed the Protected Area Isolation Index that is going to be published in Science in the 3rd of June. So congratulations to Robin and his team. And PACHA is going to be one of the landscapes to test this new index to measure connectivity. How connected are the protected areas or the ecological network? But also Dave Theobald from the CLLC, he has developed and his team a new index called ProNet that measure connectivity at different levels, different kind of movements. If I'm not wrong, it's in peer review right now, so hopefully it's going to be published soon. So we are going to share this data with the scientists and using PACHA as a pilot to prove how well this works, because the isolation index is more based on functional connectivity and the ProNet in structural connectivity. Also want to share this data with the decision makers, as they were saying before. So for that reason, we have engaged also with TerraDAP, which is an amazing tool, at least to me, because they use the most accurate land use change and climate change data to update these ecological corridors every year. So that can be used for decision makers to take decisions of planning, the land use planning. And also, but I know that many people here in WWF, we are divided in 9 practices. I'm for wildlife practice, but there are others that take care of food, forests, or markets. And these colleagues, they want to work outside of the protected areas, which is the important thing, one of the most important things of this initiative, that everything happens outside. And they say, okay, we have these huge landscapes, where are we going to work? And they say, okay, we can suggest you to use the connectivity corridors to, for example, do proof of concepts about nature positive agriculture, to engage with the companies to do a better management of their land. So again, sharing the data, the data we are receiving, we want to transform it and share with other colleagues from, they are not scientists, they are not biologists, but they can be used also by them. So thank you so much. Just to say that sometimes sharing data can be a problem because a communication problem, but also if you talk with the people and you build the trust, you can get their confidence and they can share the data with you and work with you. So thank you so much, and be happy to share any question.
That was such an interesting practical case study in the challenges of actually asking people and working with people to getting some claps, working with people to share data and the challenges that entails. One of the first questions that was posted by Valentina in the chat was she was asking, how do you use your data for policy and governance decisions?
Well, the idea is to provide them the corridors, to say, here you have a wildlife, ecological corridor, wildlife corridor. So you should do some actions to protect it, or to do some policies to land use management, so we can secure the ecological connectivity in this corridor. And we as WWF, we do that. We collaborate, especially with local governments, to make this land use plans. Sometimes they don't have the capacity, especially here in Bolivia. So we can help them with technical information, and this is one of the things that we can supply to them when they say, okay, I want to protect, but where? Which are important areas? Well, ecological corridors are.
Lisa, I just saw your comment in the chat, and we actually saw your question highlighted. We have your question from your registration highlighted. I was wondering if you wanted to jump in. Do you have a mic?
I think I do. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we do. We can. Do you want to jump in and share some of your concerns?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that actually the idea of data sharing, sensitivity, and it's not just in South America, but that is where I have worked primarily. And I have also run into this. Originally, I was sharing all the data, making DOIs. But with our more recent and bigger project, I have a lot of collaborators. And so, you know, opinions, I have been surprised, have been profoundly negative about open access data sharing. So this is a regional problem. It's probably not going to go away in my lifetime, especially from the South America context. I was really surprised, you know, young and old, experienced student. There's just a lot of negative, you know, resentment that first world people take data they worked for, you know, no money on, and they make their careers off of their backs again and again and again. And so, you know, I would just say, and this is something I brought up to Sarah, that there are models that, you know, someone said are resentment free, where if someone wants to use data, there are actually ways to contribute to projects. Rainfor with plot data, the tropical plot data, tree plot data network has been looking at this. And so I think that the animal movement group maybe need to look at those sorts of issues as well. My final point that I think is important, and Sarah pointed this out, it's up to the publishers and scientific journals. If they allow a way to have a DOI that you still retain some control, that would be very helpful for someone like me who would like to make DOIs available, but with some level of control. Also, sometimes we're responsible to our funders, like Fundação Boticário requires any publication that they helped fund, you know, have proper authorship and recognition of them, which doesn't happen when it's a secondary use. So I guess that's about all I had to say, but I'm interested in other people's thoughts on all this.
No, if I can jump, sorry, no, but I totally agree with Lisa. No, I have the same feeling. But in fact, in the past, we have to recognize that there was some kinds of abuse, no, when the scientists here in South America, especially from the United States, came here, use data or use the knowledge of the local researchers. But I don't think that is happening anymore. In my experience, as I said, I've been working here for 20 years. I have seen a lot of collaboration between people from Europe and Latin American countries, but it still remains. No? It's still in the memories of the people, and they have that concern. And also, what is a big reality is that it takes a lot of time to publish, much more than you. So if I give you my data, you're going to publish in 2 months, and it would take me like 6 months or more to do that. That's also a reality we have to take into consideration. And yes, when we were asking for the data, they publish data. I want to repeat it again. They publish data. The idea is at the end is to have a paper with this ecological network, and of course, all of them sharing the data are going to be co-authors of this paper. And this is good because data that have been already used, have been already published, can be used again. So yeah, although we explained them, as I said, I think it was a comms problem that make all this trouble.
Sarah, did you want
to? No, go ahead.
I love your story, Rafael, because I can imagine, I guess one question is like, how would you approach it differently if you started over again? But I also like getting to, you know, what all the topics that Lisa brought up. I mean, I think what you're doing is super important because as I've seen is you see people who originally are very, very hesitant about sharing data. And then after they have a successful experience with it, then they don't see it as an enemy, right? They see how they benefited from it. They see how their data, became more useful because of it. And so there's this sometimes very slow movement towards being, trusting it and being familiar with how it works for you. And so I think what you're doing is kind of some important groundwork for making people, because it's totally, legit to ask questions about data sharing and under what circumstances. But you want to not start out with a total, it's to move from a profoundly negative view of the concept to one okay, I'm open to discussion here. That's a movement, I think, in a good direction. So how would you advise something like that again? Is there an order that you would, would you have changed, how would you have reordered the agenda maybe?
Yeah, I think that we failed because we didn't give to the expert a voice at the beginning of the workshop, and we did it. We recognize what we have to do it, but we should do it at the beginning. We thought, okay, we have read their papers. We know what they are publishing. We know what they are doing or what they did at least. But we should listen to them first. Give them more participation. And I saw Jeffrey, he's here, he raised his hand because he was part of this group. I would love to listen his opinion, because he's in the, what Avi was saying before about sharing data, these open sources. Jeffrey has an impressive paper on Jaguar movement, and he shared all this data. It's one of the main sources for this information. Jeffrey, I would love if you can jump in and give us your impression on your thoughts about all these things, because you were he was part of this workshop.
He did have his hand up. So Jeffrey, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to chime in. I'm a bit reluctant to do it on these big things, but like Rafael said, I was part of that process. And I think, I want to say, I think that Rafael's characterization is a little off. And it's in line with what Lisa was saying, was myself and my other Jaguar researchers, most of them collaborators, our issues weren't necessarily sharing data at all. As Rafael said, I was co-author, as many as the others, on a large data paper where we made 117 Jaguar telemetry data sets available publicly. The issue was that we have a group of collaborators, multinational, transboundary collaborators, working on issues of connectivity. And basically the question was, why did, all of a sudden WWF and Center for Large Landscape Conservation shows up and wants to do exactly what we're doing and wants our data. So the question was, why, we're doing that, and why do we need you? And it wasn't very clear if we were being just asked for our data and that was it, or we were being asked to collaborate. And so, and it wasn't just our collaborations. There were several students working on dissertations. They need to publish. And so there was a lot of conflicts there. And I think that's part of the issue. I'm sorry, I live in South America. I live on $900 a month and do research. But, having people coming from the north saying, let's give us your data. We're doing this stuff. You're doing it anyway. It does put you off. So the communication needs to be better in these types of things. That's I wanted to mention. That's really, I think, the biggest issue. I don't know anybody who has any problem sharing data as long as they get recognized for it. And it's not conflicted with what they're doing. That's it.
It's kind of the basis for any good collaboration is the initial trust and the communication and the time it takes to build that sort of relationship, and you can't speed it up, right? Sounds like the point that you're making. Yes,
I totally agree with Jeffrey. We fail in this communication thing. well, I think we resolved it, and now I have received your email, Jeffrey, this morning. So thank you, thank you so much for your expert knowledge. Thank you, very timely.
All right, I think there's a bigger conversation here around supporting data sharing and data standards. I'm going to hold the rest of the question. There's also a whole conversation happening about poaching in the chat. So we're going to hold that to the group discussion. Rafael, thank you very much. We're going to hand over to our last speaker, who is Stu from Motus. Stu, while you get set up, let me do an introduction for you. Actually, we're really excited you're coming here today because you got a big nod in our call last week. So I think people are looking forward to hearing about Motus and your experiences. Stu, you're okay getting set up, right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay. Stu is the director of come on. Sorry, let me start again. I'm quite jet lagged. Apologies. Stu is the Director of Strategic Assets at Birds Canada. We invited Stu here as an expert on birds, migration ecology, and collective data management, who has made tremendous contributions to collaborative movement data collection and sharing through the creation of the Motus wildlife tracking system, among other achievements. Really looking forward to your talk. Do you want to take it away?
Yeah, thank you very much. Just want to confirm you guys can see my presentation properly?
We can. Yep.
Okay, great. I'm just going to get the chat going so I can see all your faces, all 9 of you anyway. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation and involvement in this series. May is a little bit crazy for us, and I wish I was paying more attention to some of the previous ones, but I'm looking forward to joining in on the next one, like in this series. And my talk right now, realize we're talking about data sharing and archiving. I'm going to touch kind of more on a little bit of everything that's being covered in this series: data collection, analysis to some extent, and the data sharing and archiving at a high level, partially because all of what we're talking about, data sharing and archiving, is integrated into Motus and not an afterthought. And I think it provides an interesting case study of how that can kind of be integrated into a system. It doesn't work for all movement ecology, but it's an interesting case study. So the going title of my talk is Mobilizing Motus, so maximizing the efficacy for conservation science, which is really what we're all talking about. So come on, just to preface, Motus is a program of Birds Canada, which is a nonprofit charitable organization in Canada dedicated to bird conservation. And together we're Canada's voice for birds, but not just birds move around, so it's not just about Canada. And I wanted to, from the tracking for migratory animals perspective anyway, and probably the same thing rings true with other technologies, is that they're all complementary. Quite often they're sort of shed in the light of being competitive, but I'd like to sort of try and squash that as much as possible. They all provide their pros and cons and their own little nuances. And Motus uses a twist on traditional radio-telemetry. And we call it collaborative automated radio-telemetry. And the concept is that we have automated receivers across the landscape. The devices we use are the smallest available for the widest ranges of animals. So the tags are down to less than 0.2 grams, which allows us to tag just about everything. Well, everything, big insects, birds, bats. Each station has relatively long detection ranges, very high temporal precision, relatively high geographic precision. There's no need to recapture the animals. And as we get more into the topic here, centralized data management and multiple technology and delivery partners, including all of the project partners. Now, why the methods are important, you'll see a little bit later. How Motus works is that these radio tags are put on, in this case, a red knot or a bat or an insect. Stations around the world collect information from those tags, and all the data is piped back to the central Motus database and then distributed to partners and made available to the public. So it sounds simple, but how this is just kind of a more in-depth view of the same. We have projects and collaborators that are all doing their independent projects, but in the background, they're all coordinated and collaborating whether they like it or not. It's ingrained in the system. Their animals fly around the world, are detected by stations, all that data comes back to Motus Central, and from there, we can make it available to the public through a public interface, reprocess aspects of the data for education and outreach activities, ensure background pipelines to nature counts, which is our sort of biodiversity data set at Birds Canada, archive Movebank as well where appropriate, and nature counts is also part of the avian knowledge network. And I'm out of place to talk about background connections to GBIF, but it's all being designed in that fashion where it can all speak together, although we still have a lot of work in terms of integrating it with Movebank and integrating the data sets with GBIF, but the intention is there, and that's the starting point. So when you combine all these data from multiple projects across multiple stations, you get some pretty remarkable data at a variety of scales. And this animation just shows the fall migration of Swainson's thrushes from Ontario, and then a return spring migration of thrushes leaving Colombia. And it ties Motus into and defines Motus as a collaborative international network of radio-telemetry projects that undertake research and education on the ecology and conservation of migratory animals. Infographics available on the website, or will be soon. Just sort of dives into more detail. I'm not going to go through it about various scales where we can apply the technology at the local level, at a regional level. And as the distribution of stations increases, you can start to get this hemispheric or global perspective. And even though the tracks here are generalized, they're a representation of actual tracks from a variety of species, and I'll talk about that later. I'm going to gloss over the infrastructure and technology, but it's an important part of the data collaboration and the sharing is it all starts like at the tag and receiver level, and then has to permeate through the entire system. It's nothing we can't do it at the end and backtrack. We have to keep that sort of train of thought going through the entire process from the time the tag is deployed. And there's a spirit of openness within Motus and sharing. So there's 3 different receiver types, 2 are commercial and 1 is open source. But all the data is being collected in the same fashion, or at least complementary, so that it can all streamline into the Motus database behind the scenes. And I'll just leave the slide so that people watching later can go back and like take a look. And then just for reference, the tags range in size from, as I said, less than 0.2 grams all the way up to 3 grams. And the length of time that those tags exist varies. And then there's also solar and hybrid tags, which have virtually unlimited life. And that lifespan can be incredibly important for managing the background metadata, which is sort of the keeps Motus tied together. Then we have the on-the-ground station deployments, which are in some places grids or strategic fence lines. And as you piece that together, you start to get a global network. Now this, obviously we have the distribution is biased into Eastern North America and North America generally in the Western Hemisphere, but there's a burgeoning network growing in Europe and other locations. And this map I made just a few months ago, and then I looked at the map again today. I can't keep up. It's a subtle difference, but Western North America is filling in I can't keep up, and California is absolutely on fire. So it's really exciting to see this growing. And what's really valuable about Motus is that it's the altruistic approach where everybody's sort of feeding on top of each other, rather than it being a centralized strategy for national rollout. And I'm going to gloss over a bit in the interest of time. So from a scribble on a whiteboard at Western University, it's now grown into a global collaborative of over 1,300 stations across 31 countries. And the data consists of 32,000 tags of about almost 300 species, and that's resulted in about 4 billion detections in the system, which is quite a lot. And that has been driven by 500 projects with over 1,400 collaborators. And almost at our 150th publication. I suspect the 150th one's in my email. It's just, I haven't caught up with that yet. So when you pool all these data together, this is a little dated and obviously Eastern North America biased. You get quite a remarkable web of pathways and movements and priorities and places to focus. It's also somewhat biased based on the station position, but there are ways to deal with that. And it, as I probably said it 3 or 4 times before, but it's all driven by the collaborators and the projects, and everybody agrees holistically to this altruistic framework from the outset. So by registering a station or a tag with Motus, you're agreeing to the terms of the collaboration policy, which I'll get to in a little bit. Much of the on-the-ground work is managed by regional coordination and leadership, so these on-the-ground champions and this network around the world that is overseeing the deployment of stations. All of the metadata is centrally managed, so each project has their own project page. They can manage and add all of their collaborators, the institutions, manage their citations, so each project has an individual citation that if people access the data, they can cite it appropriately. And then each project page has details on what's being tracked and where, and also station deployment details. That's just different Explore tools that'll be released soon, just to give you an example of the types of data that's available. And this is all publicly available. The whole point, Motus, is that if you want data from your station, you need to give data from your station. There's no halfway. And we're also picking into schools. So there's about Motus stations on 20 or 30 different schools and nature centers, and they have direct access to the data that's being collected at their station. So what species are flying over and when, and different mutations, as well as case studies about species that they may encounter at their sites. The value-added conservation, like this services that we're hoping to integrate with Motus, is to make aspects of the data that is publicly available into some larger scale hemispheric conservation efforts that are underway. One is the Migratory Bird Initiative being overseen by Audubon. Another example is an atlas of migratory connectivity being done by the Smithsonian and Georgetown University. And that just allows all contributors to Motus to contribute to these higher level endeavors without having to be directly involved. It just all is piped, and they have that sort of higher level order beyond level of their projects. So the why is why Motus, or why that model? It's this sort of wonderful combination of a traditional community and citizen science. It's a positive feedback loop. So the more data you collect, the more stations you have, the better the data is, and it just keeps cycling. And all of the metadata and detection data is shared openly, at least at a high level, not the detection data. You can't go on the website and download data that you would need to publish a paper, but you can go on the website and view all the movements and sort of see it at the highest level. And we have various different permissions in place in the background that allow all the collaborators to specify at what level they want their data to be available. But the general buy-in from day one is that the basic public data is open and freely available, and there's no choice in that matter. As I said, you have to, if you want data from other stations, you have to give data from yours. And then all of the data is permanently archived and the Motus database. So the collaboration policy is intended to maximize the efficacy of Motus data for science, conservation, and wildlife resource management. As I mentioned before, by registering a receiver or tag, Motus collaborators agree with the terms of the policy. We're pushing towards open data as much as possible, and some of that data is open by default. So that includes tag metadata. So what species the bird was on and the date of deployment and where it was deployed. All the information from a station is open, and summary tag detection. So the tag moved from point A to point B is open data, but the details underpinning that, like the exact timestamps, is not. So a researcher can't go in and push the data per se, but can view it and share results for various purposes. Currently, the data access is only available for the registered collaborators for those projects, but we're working on ways to make the data available across projects, as one of our speakers mentioned earlier, particularly following that GBIF model is very inspiring with custom DOIs across projects. But as Abby would say, that's not too easy. So that's what we want to do, but we're not quite there yet. Lastly, I don't know where my time is, so feel free to cut me off at any time, but I'm wrapping up. and I glossed over a bit. All the Motus data is centralized through an R package. There's tools and guidelines for sharing how the data is visualized, cleaned, and analyzed within that package, and constantly looking for improvements and different things there. As I mentioned, all of the data that I can share, I glossed over examples and I didn't really show that, but it's all available on the website. You can look up any species or station and view it all. All the publications, most to date, are collaborator driven, so within each project, but there's lots of opportunity for cross project analysis and meta-analysis, and some of that is underway. I mentioned augmented data projects, and I mentioned the cross-project data citation management that I hope we'll implement soon. And another underpinning issue is safeguards for sensitive species. So we do have the ability to make private projects or make certain data private, but from our perspective, that's kind of a last resort, because it's counterintuitive to the whole model, but there is in particular species or areas where you don't want to share that data. So all that's sort of covered. So I apologize for rushing. I don't know if I did the 10 minutes or not, but I can elaborate as much as needed in the question period. And you can learn more at any of these locations here, and a bunch of my more generic presentations that talk about the results and how it works are available on the website or elsewhere as well. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to what we can achieve.
Yeah, that was wonderful. My first question kind of speaks to the future. What's your vision for Motus? Like, where do you think where could it go? It's focused on birds right now, but is there opportunity? And this speaks to one of the questions that popped up in our registration, which was, what are the opportunities for collaboration between terrestrial and aquatic movement ecologists in terms of data sharing and archiving, and what barriers are there? I wondered if you could speak to that, because you're focused on birds right now.
Yeah, the limitation of the technology is such that it's pretty much a volant species, a flying animal system, and at least the way it's designed. So it's best for birds that are aloft, and that's just how you get the best detection distances, and you can get that sort of constant feed off the tags, which can give you behavioral information. The concept is sound for other types of tracking, but as soon as you get into bigger animals, satellite telemetry becomes more appealing, and there's other technologies that do a better job. So Motus's niche is more the smallest of the small that you can't put a satellite tag on, and it may be years before we get there. There's similar, it's analogous to the ocean tracking network in the oceans for sharks and fish, but there, as of yet, not much cross-pollination, although we're putting Motus stations in the ocean. It doesn't work the other way around. And the future is, well, there's a lot of directions it could go. Keeping up with the technology is one of the greatest challenges, but with the advent of global cellular and Wi-Fi networks, it makes it much more easy for stations to talk to tags and for tags to talk to stations. It's not far off to turn every cell phone into a receiver device. It's not far off to turn everybody's computer into a receiver. So, with the right level of investment, you can take our network of 1,400 stations and blow it up considerably. But I'm getting more into like pipe dream type stuff, but it's all conceivable and possible with the right investments. And the concept from our perspective is really just sort of the ultimate ground-based system for tracking animals, and at least the smallest animal. And so sorry, I rambled a bit, but
no, I mean, pipe dreams are kind of the part of what we want to hear about here. So it's very, and our speakers have the best view on what those possibly could be. So we're really curious to hear about them. Speaking of funding, David Savage, I think your question kind of fits in there. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so you have all these different independent groups that are putting up their own receivers. I'm just wondering, like, what kind of funding sources are they using to get those things up and running?
Yeah. I'm going to address one of the things that Stephanie mentioned first, and then I'll hop to your question. And that is the focus on birds, but that's just kind of the function of birds being an attractive funding source, and they move farther. But there is an active group on bats, and bats is actually pushing the expansion in a lot of regions, because like we think we know nothing about birds, we know zilch about bats. So there's a great opportunity for Motus for bats, and then insects as well. But unfortunately, there's just fewer insects that are big enough. But we can put them on wasps and bumblebees, so we're getting pretty small. One of the great things about Motus is that it is modular, so people can join in at any level. So at the station level, you're looking at 4 to 10K per station. So quite often that funding is part of large research grants, but often it's just an Audubon Society or a private donor or a nature center that can cobble enough money together. You set up a station and you're part of the network and you're collecting data for everybody. So there's those models that are more passive station based, and then there's the models that are very active where there's tagging projects deploying stations. So I don't know if that answered your question about the funding, but it is accessible at sort of many of those levels. So it's hard to pinpoint one source for a lot of this stuff.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to ask all of the speakers to join us back in and move us into kind of a discussion, more of a discussion mode. Those two, if you have a second, I'd have a little look back through the chat as well and see what people are dropping in. But to get us started for the panel discussion, so lack of data standards was one of the main constraints we heard about in our recent data conservation tech research, which I mentioned before. And it was really emphasized heavily in our biologging group in particular. Standards were also brought up in the first event of this series, and we promised we'd talk about it in this event. And in that first event, there was some information shared about the Biologging Society Standards Working Group, as well as a recently proposed framework for biologging data. But this is really obviously a really big challenge. So to clarify, what's the goal with standardization and what do you think is needed to reach that goal? Sarah, do you want to take a first crack at it, and then I'll throw to everyone else? And feel free to add commentary as well.
Okay, I've been deep in the chat here, so I'm coming out of the chat. The goal, well, I guess, we kind of have talked a lot about that. It could make a lot of what we're doing easier. It could save a lot of money, honestly, right? Because people would be spending less time building their own infrastructures, and we have tag companies who are having to meet lots of requests for different standards types of things that could have one more smooth process. It could improve our ability to upscale. Just look at what Abby was showing us of the ways that data from GBIF are being used in IPCC reports. Our data are generally not there. We're not there. And so, the data where we have these, I was going to ask Abby, could you put that that paper, the DOI for the how to aggregate the sensitive data stuff? If all of our data were there, would those reports look different? And would people be pretty jazzed to know that they were part of the global biodiversity report and the climate report? We're just not, I don't know that a lot of us in movement ecology see us as, we care about that. We see it as adjacent to what we're doing, but it's oh, well, we don't contribute to it. But why? We could if we had standards. So I don't know, does that kind of thing get people excited? Or is that only me? I don't know. What else? What was the other part of your question?
What do you think? What do we need to get there to make data used in?
Okay, so let's take the easiest thing we can think of is this idea of getting, for example, the tracking data into GBIF. We have done some work on this. There's some of this being done. There's some proposals being done. I'm working on a project on this right now that's sort of a prototype system. And we're going to have, it's going to be all open access, and there's an R package for it. And there's, and so the thing is so we have these prototypes, or we have the other, I'll post that other paper as well, the standardization framework. So we have some things where we've cobbled together an idea. And we have quite a bit of community involvement in that idea. But then who is to approve it? And then who's going to pay for it to get implemented? Part of it is we're all kind of in our working on our projects, or those of us who are working on these different platforms, you know, like Stu and I, we've had a thing about getting the Motus data into Movebank. We have it, like, I mean, we're 90% there, but like we need to get it, you know, we need the time to get it done, and we're super busy. So money. I think we need some, you know, we need dedicated resources to implement it, and then we need some, who's going to approve it. We need to somehow have some forum, you know, for biodiversity, it's TEDWG. And that's this incredible resource, because you can go and suggest, you know, we need to add this, we need to do this, we need a working group to sort this out. We have one for machine observations, a working group at TEDWG. And so there's some process for doing it, and then it could get approved. But I don't feel like we have a thing like a resource like that, a structure for that.
You're suggesting a kind of carrot and the stick approach. Is that what I'm getting from the chat? The strong arm.
I haven't been looking.
Yeah,
at the
sorry, I
chat.
was catching up. It's kind of an aside,
it
side issue with the question Sarah asked. But with metadata sharing, it was just, we're flirting with the idea of not releasing data until all the metadata is populated. And that's one way. It's kind of a strong arm. So an approach we don't want to take, but yeah, I think it'll be effective.
Did you have any thoughts about the what Sarah was saying, taking on the goal of standardization? Like, what do you think is needed to reach that, and like what it could enable?
Yeah, there are folks better suited to speak about what it could enable in terms of meta-analysis and combining all of the data that we have. But the barriers to making it done, as Sarah said, are the funding. Most of these types of stuff are side of desk endeavors, nice to haves, but then inevitably they just get bogged down. So either, you know, funding at the individual project level that sort of just sees that through, or even at the higher level where someone can do those final steps and that legwork to coordinate across groups. I think part of the problems, as that was alluded to earlier, is there are just so many groups that you end up with 15 standards. But I think we're getting better at having just a few, but it's just that I hate to default to funding. But it's not just funding, it's a capacity issue. We all want to do good things. There's 100 people on this call wanting to do the right thing. Yeah, that higher level leadership to see it done is a challenge.
Feels like funding comes when you can sell a vision of what it will achieve, right? And I think telling that story of, okay, if we could just do this, like it's interesting because we have 100 people on the call, but the last two calls we had 240 people, and we suspect it's because we were talking about data standards and archiving, which like sound quite boring, but they're so critical to like all other parts of what we're discussing in the movement ecology chain. And I wonder if Sarah, you just articulated like, and listening to Abby as well, articulating what it means if we had data standards and if we had like great data sharing, what that could enable is actually the linchpin for unlocking funding and movement forward. That's just my perception as a somewhat of an outsider and with a broad view of the tech landscape, the conservation tech landscape. But I wanted to move us to another question that Sarah, you also brought up, which is looking to other fields. Like, what other fields can we work with? Are there other models we can be other lessons learned and other sectors that could be paving the way? I was wondering if what experience or ideas that the panel had in that space.
I don't have that much experience with it, and others here might, so I would open it up for anyone. I know, like, I have worked with a few people who are kind of on the agricultural side who are collecting this stuff, and they're like, the sharing is not like in scope often, or at least in my few cases I've worked with, like the idea of kind of like harmonizing the data into a Movebank in this case was pretty novel, and they had great data, but it took a lot, and they were smart about it, and it was good data, and they were very, easy to work with as far as like they understood the questions, the technical stuff, but it was very novel to them to be like participating in some sort of shared infrastructure, because they're working on like they're trying to help this farm, right? They're doing a very focused thing. What were the other field? I mean, medical, I don't know. I would see if other people do. I just see a lot of overlap in the types of data. I don't know if there's if Christian Roots or if other folks are here that are involved in the COVID-19 biologging initiative. That's been interesting because we've been engaging a lot with human mobility data. And how those are collected, which is a little bit, into the other fields realm. I haven't been directly involved in that, but that's been super interesting because they have their own data sharing and kind of interoperability stuff going on as well.
Christian's here. Christian, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that. So, what we've learned during the COVID-19 biologging initiative, where we tried to gather animal tracking data that had been collected before, during, and after COVID-19 lockdowns to find out how movements were affected by the presence or absence of humans, is that the animal tracking bit is actually the easy part. So getting access to those human mobility data sets is even more difficult, quite simply because most of the high quality data sets are being owned by big tech and are not publicly available. And I know that some data have been released as part of the response to the pandemic, such as the Google mobility reports, but they usually use a form of aggregation and reference to baselines that makes them very difficult to use for the kinds of applications we might be interested in looking at human-animal interactions, for example. But one other point I perhaps can make briefly is, I just said the easy bit was the animal tracking, getting the animal tracking data. Actually, it's not easy and it's surprisingly difficult. And we think that when we put out these calls for collaboration, we got this phenomenal response. We've now got more than a billion GPS locations in our database for this project. But we think that's just the tip of the iceberg. And what is really frustrating is that the existence of these tracking data sets is not discoverable to us. So we have to resort to running social media campaigns, using our own networks, sending messages to mailing lists to try and reach all these people who may own data sets. And of course, we have the data repositories like Movebank, but even they currently only capture a very small proportion of what has been collected. And so one idea I've been toying with, and I would be really interested in hearing people's thoughts on this, is to perhaps set up a tagged registry. So rather than archiving the data sets, that's what we all want, and sharing the data sets publicly, it would really help us as a community, I think, if we had a global inventory of all the tags that have been deployed on wild animals. So imagine you could, at a push of a button, say, who has tags on sharks for this time period, or who has data for any sort of animal in Antarctica. And that is not the same as making those data sets available. What I envisage is a registry where people have their contact information and can then be approached by project leaders.
I love this idea, but I would like to throw out the idea of not just having it for tags, but having it for all conservation technologies. Because one of the questions we keep getting asked by people coming into the sector is like, how many people are using technologies? And like having a registry of like all the camera traps out there would be fascinating alongside all of the tracking data. Abby, thoughts?
Yeah, Ariel mentioned in the chat, along these lines, I participate in the Earth Science Information Partners, and in that arena, there are a lot of like NOAA and NASA folks who are working with weather data and other, and I get so jealous because they all share their data and they do it just as a matter of course, and they use standards, and it's not even a question of whether or not you're going to share the data. But I think about how we could really get to a place where we have like a weather tracking system for species, where we could really, like, we know what's going to happen because we're tracking them so well and we're sharing the data, it's all integrated and we can make predictions, and we're just so far from that. It's but the data is there. Like, I think it's possible to do it. It's just so hard because for all these issues that people have talked about. But I think it would be really exciting to have like a species weather system. And I guess the other thing I wanted to say, which kind of goes back to your earlier question, Stephanie, is about like, people spend a lot of time integrating data together. And so like those projects that Sarah, where all the authors on it. And so, so much time is sunk into getting the data together and bringing it together. And then nothing ever, then there's just a paper, and all that work, all that effort tends to be lost that we've done to bring these together. And that's what I think standards can help with, is that we don't have to repeat that process every time we want to ask a big question. So,
Rafael, I'm aware we haven't heard from you for a little while. Was there something you wanted to add to the conversation?
Well, that's a thing that is a little bit more of my expertise, but I'm learning a lot. Thank you so much. But this global data sharing is not something I'm involved right now.
I mean, as having had practical experience on a smaller scale, not a global scale, of data sharing, and having had to work through the challenges of collaboration, surely there's lessons to be learned as that scales up, right? Are there any things that you would point to as particularly important for thinking through collaboration around data sharing, and on the data sharing side, less so the archiving and the standard side?
Yes, as Jeff was saying, and I agree with him. You have to be very clear on what data you need, what are you going to do with that data, and how are you going to recognize the participation of other of the data owners. So and build trust. Build trust is very important. For example, I was seeing in the chat that someone was criticizing one of these platforms to collect the data, and others would say, no, this is good, it's not bad. Honestly, I don't know none of them, because as I said, I'm not in that field. But it's a lot about, again, it's trust. One of the participants was not trusting in this platform, and that's one of the main issues for not to use it, for not share the data with another person. And I've been in both sides. Now I'm asking for the data, but I'm also been asked for my own data to be part of a larger thing. And well, I think it's my experience has been very, very good. But I've been recognized. I've been part of the publication, so I think it's in my experience, I strongly recommend to do it, of course.
I'm conscious we're drawing to a close. I just wanted to give everyone a chance to have a last thought. And it seems like we might be coming out of this with maybe more questions than answers, but with a lot of valuable ideas having been thrown around both in the chat and in the discussion. I'd like to ask the speakers, if you could change or get support for one thing that you think would revolutionize this field, what would that be? Sarah, do you want to go first?
One?
Just one. Well, okay.
No, I'd better just do one, because we're like at the end of time. Well, okay, so I could bounce off Christian's idea. So say we had a tag registry, and then we had, that was part of like a metadata registry, right? And so that would be a step of standards where you're the biologging COVID-19 initiative, and you want to go in and who's got data where, and you could search and you could find, oh, here's 20 studies at the Ocean Tracking Network, here's 50 studies at Motus, here's 100 studies at Movebank, here's, I don't know, maybe people could register for other, regional databases, whatever, and you could, that would be one standard. And that would be, could be like a starting point. It would do a ton. And it wouldn't have to address it doesn't need to be public. It could be sensitive, that wouldn't answer all questions at once, but it would do a lot. I don't know.
Abby, do you want to go next?
So one thing to fund, if I had money, I would fund more people to help with aligning data to the standards, because it's relatively easy to do, but it does take a little bit of effort. And so if I had money to just throw at that problem, I think we'd see a lot more data shared.
Rafael, what would you do to revolutionize the field?
Well, if I have, as I says, if I had a lot of money, I would incentivize researchers all around South America, all around the world, to put, for example, all the data of camera traps in a database. I know they already exist, but if you get there, you find very little information, probably because it's time consuming, it's not rewarding. So I would try to reward these people to put this information in this database so anyone can access to that.
And Stu, you have the final word. What would you do to revolutionize?
All the things everybody else said, but also I hate to use the term regulatory, but one of the things we're working towards, and it's happening in Canada, where if you want to band a bird, all that data is regulated. It has to be public and made available to the public repository. We're hoping that Motus will be the same, where if you want to tag an animal, the data has to go to an archive. But combining that regulatory stamp with an incentive program, because all of that data is for benefit of the global community, would be ideal, rather than just keep weighing more on the researchers' shoulders. And paying them back somehow is incredibly important.
The 9% figure is the thing that's staying with me most strongly from this talk. And so on that note, I would like to thank all of our speakers and everyone who's joined us today for the discussion and the really lively chat. We'll be back in 2 weeks for our final session, which is, as I said, looking to the future and thinking big picture about where we could be going with questions we're asking and innovation and technology. So please join us next time and we'll see you there. Bye, everyone.